For most of recorded history, power has followed the same quiet script. A system rises by solving a real problem. It brings order where there was chaos. It simplifies trade, stabilizes trust, and lowers friction. Over time, people stop noticing the system itself and begin treating it as natural law. It becomes the background architecture of daily life, so familiar it feels permanent. And then, without ceremony, it begins to fail. The pattern is old. Ancient city-states built trade networks around silver weights that worked until they didn't. Empires standardized coinage to project authority, only to dilute it under pressure. Maritime powers dominated global commerce through trusted bills of exchange until debt quietly outgrew discipline. Each system expanded beyond its original purpose. Each promised stability, each assumed continuity, and each ended the same way. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a long, subtle erosion of confidence. The turning point is rarely announced. There are no speeches, no emergency declarations. The system still functions. Prices are still quoted. Contracts are still signed. The symbols remain intact. What changes is something less visible and far more dangerous. Behavior. Participants begin to hedge without admitting they are hedging. Alternatives once dismissed as inefficient suddenly feel prudent. Redundancy replaces optimization. Trust becomes conditional. The system is still used, but no longer believed in the same way. This is how monopolies truly end, not through rebellion, but through quiet substitution. The most powerful monetary systems in history did not lose dominance because they were attacked. They lost it because the incentives that sustained them stopped working. The issuing authority accumulated obligations faster than it could generate productive output. The benefits of the system flowed outward, while the costs concentrated inward. Over time, discipline weakened, not out of malice, but necessity. The rules that once enforced restraint became politically inconvenient. Temporary measures became permanent. Confidence was maintained through scale and habit rather than fundamentals. At first, nothing appears wrong. Markets adapt, institutions reassure, data points are explained away. The system's sheer size creates the illusion of safety. After all, everyone is still using it. Everyone still needs it. Everyone still believes everyone else believes in it, until they don't. The final stages are never marked by a single event. They are marked by a shift in assumptions. What was once unquestioned becomes quietly negotiated. What was once universal becomes optional. The system does not disappear. It simply stops being alone. When that moment arrives, history tells us something uncomfortable. The end has already happened. It just hasn't been recognized yet. Large-scale systemic collapse never looks like collapse at first. It looks like continuity. Institutions remain open, markets function, laws are enforced, transactions clear, people go to work. The machinery of daily life continues to operate, which creates the illusion that the structure itself is stable. But collapse doesn't begin with visible disorder. It begins with structural imbalance. Historically, every major system that failed followed a similar progression. First comes success. A framework emerges that solves coordination problems, standardized money, centralized authority, enforceable contracts, trusted settlement mechanisms. Productivity rises, trade expands, complexity increases. The system grows faster than the society that created it. Then comes overextension. Expansion becomes a goal in itself. Scale replaces efficiency. The system begins to serve its own preservation rather than the productivity it was designed to support. Maintenance costs rise, administrative layers thicken, decision-making slows. But because the system still delivers benefits, the strain is tolerated. The third stage is distortion. Incentives shift. Instead of rewarding production, the system begins rewarding access. Financial leverage outpaces real output. Debt expands faster than value creation. Monetary tools are used not to stabilize growth, but to delay consequences. Temporary interventions become permanent dependencies. Next comes normalization. Risk is no longer perceived as risk. It is priced in, modeled, distributed, and repackaged. Fragility becomes invisible because it is spread across institutions and instruments. The system feels more sophisticated, but becomes less resilient. Then comes behavioral adaptation. Participants adjust quietly, institutions hedge, states diversify reserves, corporations restructure supply chains. Individuals seek alternatives, not out of panic, but prudence. No one announces a loss of faith. They simply stop relying on a single pillar. The sixth stage is fragmentation. Parallel systems emerge. Redundant pathways form. Trust becomes regional, bilateral, or conditional instead of universal. The original framework still exists, but no longer monopolizes confidence. And finally, irreversibility. Once confidence decentralizes, it does not reconsolidate. No reform restores monopoly trust. No policy rebuilds universal belief. The system remains functional, but it is no longer foundational. This is what real collapse looks like. Not a breakdown of order, but a reallocation of trust. Not chaos, but substitution. Not destruction, but displacement. Empires don't fall when their institutions stop working. They fall when their institutions stop being necessary. The dangerous phase is not the moment of visible crisis. It is the long period before it, when stability feels normal, growth looks controlled, and adaptation is mistaken for strength. Because by the time the damage is undeniable, the structural shift has already occurred. Systems don't die when people reject them. They die when people no longer need them. Consider Rome, not at its fall, but at its height. For centuries, Rome's greatest advantage was not military force alone, but administrative coherence. It standardized currency across vast distances. It enforced contracts. It protected trade routes. Roman coinage, especially the silver denarius, was trusted from Britannia to the Levant. This trust reduced friction, accelerated commerce, and allowed wealth to circulate through the empire with remarkable efficiency. In its ascent, Rome aligned incentives correctly. Expansion brought spoils, but also new taxpayers. Infrastructure investments increased productivity. Roads, ports, aqueducts, and legal systems weren't symbolic. They were economic multipliers. Wealth moved through Rome, but it also stayed within Rome, reinvested into systems that reinforced growth. That balance did not break suddenly. It eroded gradually. As territorial expansion slowed, the math changed. New conquests no longer paid for old obligations. Military expenditures remained high, but the inflow of external resources declined. To maintain stability, the state leaned more heavily on internal extraction. Taxes increased. Bureaucracy expanded. Compliance replaced innovation. Monetary discipline was the first quiet casualty. The silver content of the denarius was slowly reduced. Officially, the coin retained its face value. Practically, it carried less substance. This wasn't fraud in the modern sense, it was survival. The empire needed liquidity to meet obligations it could no longer cover through productivity alone. At first, the effects were subtle. Prices adjusted, wages lagged, merchants compensated, trade continued. But confidence, once cracked, does not heal easily. People noticed that money no longer represented stored labor, it represented decree. Meanwhile, Rome's consumption rose as its productivity stagnated. Urban populations grew dependent on state distributions. Political incentives favored short-term appeasement over long-term reform. Wealth increasingly flowed outward, to frontier defense, to imported luxuries, to debt obligations, while reinvestment at the core declined. The social consequences followed predictably. Small landholders were displaced by large estates. Economic mobility narrowed. Military service shifted from civic duty to contracted necessity. Loyalty became transactional. By the time inflation became undeniable, the system was already fragmented. Barter returned in some regions. Local currencies gained prominence. Trust localized. The empire still existed. Its laws still applied. Its armies still marched. But the monetary monopoly was gone. Rome did not collapse when it was conquered. It collapsed when its economic core could no longer retain the wealth it generated. The empire remained vast, powerful, and impressive, long after it ceased to be structurally solvent. What mattered wasn't the fall of Rome. It was the moment Rome stopped being indispensable. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic occupied a position the world had never seen before. It was small, densely populated, and almost entirely dependent on trade, and yet it became the central clearinghouse of global commerce. Amsterdam was not merely a port, it was a financial operating system. The Dutch guilder was trusted because the institutions behind it were disciplined. The Bank of Amsterdam held full reserves. Contracts were enforced predictably. Accounting standards were transparent. Capital flowed into the Republic not because of force, but because of reliability. Merchants believed that value stored in Dutch institutions would remain intact. That belief became self-reinforcing. For a time, the system worked perfectly. Productivity surged, innovation flourished, financial instruments multiplied. The Dutch did not conquer territory. They conquered confidence. And as confidence accumulated, a dangerous assumption followed that the system's success had made it permanent. "This time is different" was never spoken aloud, but it was embedded in behavior. As competition intensified, returns on trade narrowed. Maintaining dominance required leverage. Debt increased, not recklessly but rationally, at least by contemporary standards. The Republic began financing consumption with financial sophistication rather than production. Capital increasingly sought yield instead of enterprise. The belief in institutional superiority delayed recognition of structural decay. After all, markets were still liquid. The guilder still circulated. Amsterdam remained central. Decline, when framed as relative rather than absolute, was easy to dismiss. But the same stages repeated. Overextension followed success. Financial complexity masked weakening fundamentals. Wealth flowed through Dutch markets in enormous volumes, yet less of it remained anchored to domestic productivity. The Republic became indispensable to others, but increasingly dependent itself. When alternatives emerged, London's deeper capital markets, England's growing industrial base, confidence began to diversify. Not collapse. Diversify. Merchants didn't abandon Amsterdam overnight. They added options. That was enough. The Dutch system didn't fail dramatically. It was outgrown. Its monopoly on trust dissolved quietly, dispersed across rising competitors that combined finance with production. The guilder remained respected long after it ceased to dominate. The pattern held. Discipline created trust. Trust enabled expansion. Expansion weakened discipline. And belief in exceptionalism delayed adaptation. History did not punish the Dutch for corruption or incompetence. It simply moved on. Because systems don't lose relevance when they are wrong, they lose it when something else becomes sufficient. The modern global system did not emerge by accident. After the mid-20th century, the world needed a neutral mechanism to rebuild trade, settle obligations, and manage risk at scale. What replaced fragmentation was a single monetary reference point, backed by deep markets, enforceable contracts, military security, and unmatched financial infrastructure. For decades it worked. A common unit of account reduced friction. Reserve holdings simplified trade. Capital flowed freely across borders. Growth accelerated. Complexity increased. The system rewarded efficiency, scale, and integration. Productivity surged in some regions, while others specialized into financial, legal, and informational services that supported the system itself. But as with every dominant framework before it, success altered incentives. Debt expanded faster than output, not because of recklessness, but because leverage was rewarded. Financial returns outpaced productive investment. Monetary expansion became a stabilizing tool rather than an emergency measure. Confidence was no longer anchored primarily to balance sheets, but to expectations of intervention. Over time, wealth increasingly flowed through the system without remaining within the productive base that sustained it. Manufacturing dispersed. Supply chains optimized for cost rather than resilience. Consumption remained high while productivity growth slowed. The system compensated with scale, liquidity, and financial innovation. None of this required malice. It required alignment. Incentives favored short-term stability over long-term discipline. Institutions responded rationally. So did governments. So did markets. What changed was behavior. States began diversifying reserves, not to reject the system, but to reduce exposure. Trade agreements increasingly bypassed universal settlement layers. Bilateral mechanisms re-emerged. Parallel infrastructures were built quietly, framed as efficiency improvements rather than strategic hedges. The system remained dominant. Transactions still cleared. Prices were still quoted. But monopoly confidence began to fragment. This is the critical distinction. The system did not weaken because it failed to function. It weakened because it was no longer the only viable option. Redundancy replaced reliance. Optionality replaced dependence. Historically, this is the exact point where decline becomes invisible to those inside it. Metrics still look strong. Institutions still command authority. The architecture still stands. But the role has changed. The system shifts from being foundational to being instrumental, from default to choice, from necessity to convenience. And once that transition begins, history shows it does not reverse. Not because the system collapses, but because the world quietly learns how to live without its monopoly. Late-stage systems always feel most stable just before they change irreversibly. This is not coincidence. It is a function of scale, narrative, and delayed consequence. By the time a dominant framework reaches maturity, it has absorbed enormous amounts of risk. That risk is managed, redistributed, and obscured through layers of institutions designed to prevent disruption. Each intervention works in isolation. Together, they create the appearance of control. Volatility is suppressed. Crises are localized. Corrections are postponed. This produces a powerful illusion that instability has been engineered out of the system. Inside institutions, warning signals are rarely ignored outright. They are contextualized, modeled, deferred. Each anomaly is treated as temporary, external, or manageable, because acknowledging structural limits would require actions that threaten the very incentives sustaining authority. It is easier to maintain the narrative of resilience than to confront the cost of adjustment. Risk also becomes normalized. Behaviors that would have been considered extraordinary in earlier phases are treated as baseline assumptions. Higher leverage is justified by liquidity. Greater exposure is defended by diversification. Fragility is reframed as sophistication. Publicly, confidence is reinforced through language. Stability is emphasized. Adaptation is celebrated. Alternatives are portrayed as unnecessary or premature. This is not deception in the theatrical sense. It is institutional self-preservation. Large systems cannot admit vulnerability without triggering the very loss of confidence they seek to prevent. The result is acceleration without awareness. As parallel systems mature, transitions that once would have taken generations occur in years. What feels incremental on the inside appears sudden from the outside. By the time outcomes register as undeniable, the underlying behavior has already shifted. This is why late-stage change feels abrupt, not because it happened quickly, but because recognition lagged reality. History shows that warnings are dismissed not due to ignorance, but because incentives reward delay. Those closest to the system benefit most from continuity. Those who move early appear unnecessary, even alarmist, until they don't. Once confidence fragments beyond a critical threshold, control mechanisms lose effectiveness, not overnight, but decisively. And at that point, stability no longer depends on policy, narrative, or intention. It depends on whether belief can still be centralized. History suggests it cannot. Every era believes it is uniquely complex. Every generation assumes its tools are more advanced, its data more complete, its leaders more informed. And yet, across centuries, the same patterns reassert themselves with quiet precision. Not because people fail to learn history, but because they live inside incentives that reward forgetting it. Systems rise when they align trust with productivity. They endure when discipline reinforces confidence, and they fade when those forces drift apart. Not through conspiracy or collapse, but through accumulation. Small decisions repeated at scale. Rational choices compounding into irreversible outcomes. When a monetary system becomes dominant, it does more than facilitate trade. It shapes behavior. It influences what is produced, what is financed, and what is postponed. Over time, the system itself becomes the objective. Preserving stability replaces generating value. Managing perception replaces restoring balance. This is not moral failure. It is structural gravity. People inside the system act logically. Institutions protect continuity. Leaders avoid disruption. Markets seek yield. Each decision makes sense in isolation. Together, they produce momentum that no single actor controls, and no single reform can reverse. History does not repeat because humans are careless or corrupt. It repeats because incentives outlast individuals. Because power centralizes until it becomes fragile. Because trust, once dispersed, does not reconverge voluntarily. The quiet loss of monopoly is not a moment of drama. It is a transition of relevance. The system continues to exist, to function, to matter. But it no longer defines the boundaries of possibility. It becomes one option among many. That is how history moves forward. Not by destroying what came before, but by outgrowing it. When future generations look back, they will not point to a single announcement or crisis. They will identify a period when behavior changed before language did, when reliance softened into preference, when certainty gave way to contingency. They will say the shift was obvious in hindsight, and they will be right. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.